The park buzzed with life on a crisp Saturday afternoon. Children's laughter blended with the rhythmic creak of swings and the crunch of sneakers against gravel. Parents chatted on benches, keeping a casual eye on their kids. Amid the usual hustle and bustle, a man stood near the playground, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He looked about 30, with a calm demeanor and a warm smile that surfaced whenever a child dashed past him. Beside him, a little girl, no older than 5, clutched a bright pink teddy bear, her blonde curls bouncing as she giggled at the antics of the other children. The man bent down to her level, speaking softly. "Do you want to join them on the slide?" The girl shook her head. "No, I like watching." He chuckled. "Okay, but if you change your mind, let me know." A woman nearby watched the pair, her gaze narrowing. She was dressed impeccably, her pearl necklace catching the sunlight as she adjusted her wide-brimmed hat. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she observed the man's every move. Something about the scene seemed off to her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her polished fingernails tapped against her phone as she debated whether to say something. Finally, she stood and walked toward a group of mothers sitting on a nearby bench. "Do you see that man over there?" she asked, her voice low but insistent. "The one with the little girl?" One of the mothers glanced over and shrugged. "Yeah, what about him?" The woman leaned in closer, her tone dripping with concern. "Doesn't it seem unusual? A man like that with a child like her?" The mothers exchanged uncertain glances. One of them hesitated before saying, "He could be her father, or maybe a family friend." The woman shook her head, her expression tightening. "No, I don't think so. Something feels wrong. I mean, look at them. Do they even look related to you?" Her words hung in the air, and though none of the mothers seemed convinced, they also didn't outright dismiss her suspicion. Sensing their hesitation, the woman's confidence grew. "I think I should call someone," she said firmly, pulling out her phone. "Just to be safe. Better to be cautious than regretful later, right?" The mothers exchanged uneasy looks but said nothing. The woman dialed the police, her voice firm, as she explained the situation. "Yes, hello. I'm at the city park, and there's a man here with a little girl who doesn't look like she belongs to him. I'm not accusing anyone, but it seems suspicious, and I think someone should check it out." As she spoke, the man noticed her glance in his direction. He frowned slightly but said nothing, turning his attention back to the girl, who was now tugging on his sleeve. "Can we go get ice cream?" she asked, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "Of course," he said with a smile. "Let's go." The two started walking toward the park's exit just as a police cruiser pulled up, its flashing lights cutting through the idyllic scene. The woman waved them over, her expression triumphant. "That's him," she exclaimed, pointing toward the man. "Over there, with the little girl." The officers approached quickly, their demeanor professional but serious. "Excuse me, sir," one of them said as they neared. "Can we talk to you for a moment?" The man looked surprised but stopped, his grip on the girl's hand tightening protectively. "Is something wrong, officer?" The lead officer glanced at his partner before responding. "We received a report about a possible, unusual situation involving you and this child. Can you explain your relationship with her?" The man's eyes flicked toward the woman, who was watching the scene unfold with a look of smug satisfaction. He sighed and crouched down to the girl's level. "It's okay," he said gently. "Can you tell them who I am?" The girl clung to her teddy bear, her eyes wide with confusion. "You're my. Her voice faltered, and the woman seized the opportunity. "See, even the child is confused. I knew something was wrong." The police cruiser rolled down the quiet suburban streets, its presence stark against the backdrop of neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. Inside, the little girl sat close to the man, her tiny hand clutching his. Her face was a mixture of confusion and unease, her grip tightening each time the car hit a bump. "It's going to be okay," the man whispered, though his voice lacked the usual warmth. He glanced at the officers in the front seat, their whispered conversation, too low to decipher. His eyes narrowed. Something about this wasn't right. The cruiser came to a stop in front of the local station. The lead officer opened the door and gestured for them to step out. "This way, sir. We just need to clear up a few details." The man hesitated, his protective instincts kicking in as he looked down at the little girl. "I want to stay with her. She's scared enough as it is." The officer nodded. "We'll keep you together. This won't take long." They were led through a side entrance, avoiding the main lobby. The hallway was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a sterile glow. The air was heavy with the faint scent of disinfectant, and the muffled sound of ringing phones added to the tension. They were directed into a small interview room. The officer gestured to the chairs on one side of the table. "Please have a seat." The man helped the girl into one chair before settling into the other, his posture tense. His eyes followed the officers as they entered, one carrying a file folder and the other holding a tablet. The lead officer sat across from them, setting the file down with a deliberate thud. "Before we continue, I want to assure you this is just a routine clarification," the officer began, his tone measured. "We're not accusing you of anything, but we received additional information that requires us to ask a few more questions." The man leaned forward, his voice firm. "What kind of information?" The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before responding. "A photo of you and the child was submitted to our system. It was flagged due to irregularities." The man's brow furrowed. "Irregularities? What does that even mean?" "She's my..." He stopped himself, looking at the little girl. "She's with me. Isn't that enough?" The officer sighed, flipping open the file. "Sir, can you explain why the names on her birth certificate and the legal guardianship document don't match?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The man's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to the little girl before settling back on the officer. "It's complicated," he said finally, "but everything is legal. I have the paperwork to prove it." The officer leaned back, studying him. "Complicated how? Help us understand." The man hesitated, his mind racing. He knew the truth would raise even more questions, but lying wasn't an option. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but low. "She's not my biological daughter. Her parents, they couldn't take care of her anymore. I stepped in to help." The officer frowned. "Stepped in how? Are you a relative?" "No," the man admitted, his gaze dropping. "But I've known her family for years. When things fell apart, I became her guardian. They trusted me." The officers exchanged another look. The partner tapped something into her tablet, her expression unreadable. The lead officer folded his arms. "Sir, we understand you might have stepped in with good intentions, but there are protocols for guardianship, legal processes that need to be followed. Are you telling us all of this was done outside those channels?" The man clenched his fists under the table, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "What I'm telling you is that I'm the only person she has left. Her parents couldn't handle their responsibilities, and I wasn't going to let her end up in the system. So, yes, maybe it wasn't conventional, but it was the right thing to do." The little girl looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Are we in trouble?" she asked softly. He softened immediately, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No, sweetheart. We're just talking." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening slightly. "Sir, do you have any identification on you? And any documentation to confirm your relationship with this child?" The man stood slowly, his calm exterior beginning to crack. "I do," he said, reaching into his pocket. "But this is ridiculous. I haven't done anything wrong." "Sir, we're just following up on a report," the officer said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Please cooperate." He handed over his ID and a folded piece of paper from his wallet. The officer examined them carefully, his brow furrowing as he read. He glanced back at the man, then at the little girl. "Wait here," the officer said, motioning to his partner to follow. The two walked a short distance away, speaking in low tones. The woman crossed her arms, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. "I knew it," she said loudly, addressing no one in particular. "I knew something wasn't right. You can't be too careful these days." The man's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his focus on the little girl, who was now clutching his leg. A moment later, the officers returned, their expressions unreadable. The lead officer handed the ID and document back to the man. "Sir, thank you for your cooperation. Everything checks out." The woman's smug smile faltered. "What do you mean? He's suspicious. Did you even check properly?" The officer turned to her, his tone measured. "Ma'am, the man has provided legal documentation confirming his relationship with the child. There's no issue here." "But," she began, her voice rising. "Ma'am," the officer interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin. "You've made a serious accusation based on assumptions. This situation could have escalated unnecessarily." The woman sputtered, her face turning red. "I was just trying to protect the child. And we understand that," the officer said firmly. "But making baseless claims can have consequences." The man knelt again, his voice soft as he spoke to the girl. "You okay, sweetheart?" She nodded, though her grip on his arm remained tight. He stood and addressed the officers. "Are we free to go?" "Yes, sir." "Sorry for the inconvenience," the lead officer said, his tone apologetic. As the man and the girl walked away, the woman called after them, her voice shrill. "I was just doing the right thing." The man paused, turning to face her. For the first time, there was anger in his eyes. The right thing would have been to mind your business or ask before assuming the worst. With that, he turned and walked away, his hand protectively on the girl's shoulder. The crowd that had gathered slowly dispersed, leaving the woman standing alone, her indignation replaced by a creeping sense of embarrassment. But just as the park returned to its usual rhythm, a voice cut through the air, familiar, authoritative, and unmistakably directed at the departing pair. "Sir, wait." It was the lead officer again, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his chest. Something had changed in his demeanor, a flicker of doubt or realization crossing his face. The man stopped, his shoulders tensing as he turned back. The officer's partner approached, holding a phone in her hand, the screen glowing with an open file. She whispered something to the lead officer, whose expression darkened. "We need to ask you a few more questions," the lead officer said, his tone careful but firm. "It's just a routine follow-up." The man's face hardened, his grip on the little girl tightening. "I've already answered your questions. What's this about?" The officer hesitated, then said, "It won't take long. Please come with us." The tension in the air was palpable as the man glanced at the little girl, her wide eyes filled with fear. He exhaled sharply, nodding. "Fine, but only if she stays with me." The officer gave a curt nod, leading them toward the cruiser. The woman watched with a mixture of vindication and confusion, her earlier confidence now replaced by a gnawing sense that she might have stirred something far more complicated than she had anticipated. As the car doors closed and the cruiser pulled away, the park seemed quieter than before, the distant hum of laughter and chatter barely masking the unease left behind. What had begun as a seemingly simple misunderstanding had spiraled into something far more unsettling, and no one watching could shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a story with far-reaching consequences. The officer's tone softened slightly. "We're not trying to make this harder on you. But when children are involved, we have to be thorough. Do you have any documentation showing consent from her parents?" The man reached into his wallet, pulling out another folded paper. He slid it across the table. "This is all I have. Her mother signed it before she left." The officer examined the document, his frown deepening. "This isn't notarized or filed with the court. It's not legally binding." The man's heart sank. "So what happens now? Are you going to take her away?" "We haven't made any decisions," the officer said carefully. "But we need to verify her safety and well-being. That's our priority." "She's safe with me," the man said, his voice rising slightly. "I've been taking care of her for months. She has a home. She's happy." "Sir, this isn't about questioning your care," the officer said, his tone still calm. "But there are procedures we're required to follow. Until we can verify everything, we may need to place her in temporary care." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He shook his head. "No, you can't do that." The officer sighed, closing the file. "We'll give you some time to talk. But please understand, this isn't personal. It's about her safety." The officer stood and left the room, leaving the man and the little girl alone. She looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't want to go," she whispered. He pulled her into a hug, his voice breaking. "You're not going anywhere. I promise." Outside the room, the officers stood in the hallway, their conversation muted. The partner glanced at the lead officer, her expression conflicted. "What do you think?" she asked. He rubbed his temples. "I think he believes he's doing the right thing. But belief doesn't equal legality." She nodded, scrolling through her tablet. "I'll call Child Services. They can decide how to proceed." Inside the room, the man stared at the door, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't let this happen. He had fought too hard, sacrificed too much to give the little girl a stable life. But now, it felt like the world was conspiring to take it all away. As the minutes ticked by, his frustration turned into resolve. He had one chance to set this right, to prove that his care was enough. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed someone who could vouch for him, someone who could speak to the love and stability he had given the girl. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. His hands trembled as he scrolled through his contacts. There was one person who might be able to help, a social worker who had once worked with the girl's family. She had seen the mess her parents had left behind and had quietly supported his decision to step in. With a deep breath, he dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello. It's me," he said, his voice shaking. "I need your help." The tension in the room thickened as he explained the situation, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'll do what I can," the woman said finally. "But this won't be easy. Are you sure you're prepared for what's coming?" He glanced at the little girl, her head resting on his arm. "I don't have a choice." The officers returned a few minutes later, their expressions neutral. The lead officer placed a folder on the table. "Sir, we've contacted Child Services. They'll be here shortly to assess the situation." The man's jaw tightened. "I've contacted someone too. She's on her way." The officer raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the air heavy with anticipation. Every second felt like an eternity as they waited for the next step, the tension building with each passing moment. Finally, there was a knock at the door. The officer opened it to reveal a woman in her late 40s, her expression calm but determined. She stepped inside, her presence commanding immediate attention. "I'm here to speak on his behalf," she said firmly. The lead officer frowned. "And you are?" "I'm a licensed social worker," she replied, handing over her credentials. "And I've worked with this child's family. I can confirm that he stepped in when no one else would." The man felt a flicker of hope as she began to explain, her voice steady and confident. But even as she spoke, he knew this was far from over. The battle for the little girl's future had only just begun, and the next move could change everything. The social worker's voice filled the room, calm yet unwavering. She spoke with authority, recounting the details of the girl's life before the man stepped in. Her words painted a stark picture of neglect and instability, parents unable to provide, a home filled with chaos, and a little girl caught in the middle. The officers listened intently, their expressions unreadable, but their occasional glances at the man hinted at doubt softening into consideration. The man sat quietly, his hands resting protectively on the little girl's shoulders. He didn't interrupt, though every fiber of his being wanted to shout, to plead, to demand they understand the depth of his commitment. His heart pounded as the social worker continued, carefully weaving the truth with just enough emotion to drive the point home. "I witnessed firsthand what this man has done for her," the social worker said, her eyes meeting the officer's firmly. "He's given her stability, love, and a chance at a normal life. Taking her away now would undo everything he's worked so hard to build." The lead officer leaned back in his chair, his expression conflicted. He glanced at his partner, who was busy tapping notes into her tablet. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. "We hear what you're saying," the officer finally replied. "And we don't doubt his intentions, but intention isn't always enough. The law is clear about how guardianship needs to be handled. And sometimes the law doesn't move fast enough to protect a child," the social worker shot back, her voice firm but not aggressive. "If he hadn't stepped in, this little girl would have been placed in a system that's already overburdened. He did what was right when it mattered most." The officer exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. The tension in the room was palpable. He looked at the man, then at the little girl, who was now clutching a small stuffed animal she had pulled from her backpack. Her wide, fearful eyes darted between the adults, her small frame huddled against the man's side. "Does she know?" the officer asked suddenly, his tone softer. The man's brow furrowed. "Know what?" "About the situation. About what might happen," the officer clarified, gesturing slightly toward the girl. The man hesitated, his throat tightening. "She's been through enough. I didn't want to scare her." The social worker interjected, her voice gentle. "She doesn't need to know the details, but she should feel secure. Children sense when something's wrong, even if they don't understand it." The man nodded, turning to the girl. He crouched down to her level, his voice soft but steady. "Hey, sweetie, I need you to be really brave for me, okay? These nice people are just making sure everything's okay. I promise, no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." Her lip quivered, but she nodded, clutching the stuffed animal tighter. "Promise, promise," he said, his voice cracking just enough to reveal the depth of his emotion. The lead officer cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "We need to contact her biological parents to confirm everything. If they can verify his story, it will help his case." The man's stomach dropped. He hadn't heard from the girl's parents in months. The last he knew, they had left town without so much as a forwarding address. His mind raced, trying to piece together how to handle this new hurdle. "I don't know where they are," he admitted, his voice strained. "They left. I haven't been able to reach them." The officer's expression darkened slightly. "That complicates things. Without their input, it's harder to validate the arrangement." "I can't control what they did," the man said, his frustration breaking through. "But I can control what I've done. I've given her a home. I've cared for her like she's my own. Doesn't that count for something?" The social worker stepped in again, her voice calm but insistent. "It should count for everything. This isn't about paperwork or protocols. This is about what's best for the child." The room fell silent again, the weight of the decision pressing down on everyone. The little girl fidgeted with the ear of her stuffed animal, her innocent movements a stark contrast to the storm of emotion swirling around her. The officers exchanged another glance, their unspoken conversation playing out in subtle nods and raised eyebrows. Finally, the lead officer stood, gathering the file in front of him. "We need to consult with our supervisor," he said, his tone neutral. "Please wait here." As the officers left the room, the man felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He looked at the social worker, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if they take her away?" She placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We're not going to let that happen. Stay calm. The more cooperative you are, the better your chances." The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every sound outside the door made the man's heart race. Footsteps, muffled voices, the occasional clatter of a phone. The little girl had fallen asleep, her head resting on his lap. He stroked her hair absently, his mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. Finally, the door opened, and the officers returned, their expressions unreadable. The lead officer sat down, folding his hands on the table. "We've reviewed everything and spoken to our supervisor," he began, his tone carefully measured. "There's no denying the effort you've put into caring for her. But without proper legal documentation, our hands are tied." The man felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His grip on the little girl tightened instinctively. "What does that mean?" "It means we have to follow protocol," the officer continued, though there was a hint of regret in his voice. "Child Services will take custody temporarily while we investigate further." "No," the man said, his voice breaking. "You can't do this. She doesn't deserve this." The social worker stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You're making a mistake. This isn't in her best interest." "We don't have a choice," the officer replied, his tone firm but apologetic. "The system is set up to protect children, and this is the only way to ensure her safety." As the words sank in, the man's mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to fight. But before he could speak, the little girl stirred, her sleepy eyes blinking open. She looked up at him, confused. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice small. He forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just rest." The officers stepped aside as two new figures entered the room, representatives from Child Services. One was a middle-aged woman with a kind but professional demeanor. The other, a younger man with a clipboard and a guarded expression. They introduced themselves briefly, their words blending into the background noise of the man's spiraling thoughts. The woman knelt in front of the little girl, her voice soft. "Hi there. My name is Lisa. I'm here to make sure you're okay." The girl clung to the man, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't want to go." Lisa's smile faltered slightly, but she kept her tone gentle. "I know this is scary, but it's just for a little while. We'll take good care of you." The man's voice cut through the air, raw and desperate. "She doesn't need to go anywhere. She's fine where she is." The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what would happen next. The man's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of what was at stake. The room was thick with tension, every second dragging like hours as the little girl buried her face against the man's chest, clutching his shirt like a lifeline. The social worker stood firm, her expression shifting from calm determination to barely concealed frustration. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, positioning herself between the man and the representatives from Child Services. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Before you make any moves, I need to remind you that removing a child from a stable, loving environment isn't something you can undo easily. I've seen what the system does to kids like her. If she leaves here tonight, the damage could be irreparable." The younger Child Services worker, clipboard clutched tightly, glanced at his colleague uncertainly. The older woman, Lisa, hesitated, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of doubt. She opened her mouth to respond, but the lead officer's radio crackled, interrupting the moment. "Unit 45, we have an urgent report. Be advised. We've located the biological parents in connection to this case. Dispatch has flagged them for immediate follow-up." The room froze. The officer stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to his radio. He exchanged a glance with his partner before stepping out of the room, his movements brisk and deliberate. The man's heart pounded as questions flooded his mind. The parents. Found. How? And why was it described as urgent? The officer returned a moment later, his face grave. "We've just received word. The girl's parents were involved in a situation earlier tonight. They were picked up by local authorities for an unrelated matter, but are now in custody. They've agreed to speak with us about their daughter." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The man's breath caught as he tried to process what this meant. He had spent months believing they had abandoned her for good, leaving no trace, no concern for her well-being. And now, out of nowhere, they were back, their sudden reappearance threatening to unravel everything. "Wait," the man said, his voice shaky but forceful. "What kind of situation are we talking about? Why are they in custody?" The officer hesitated, clearly weighing how much to disclose. "There's an ongoing investigation," he said carefully. "But what matters here is that they've been found, and they've expressed interest in speaking about her." The man felt a wave of anger rising, hot and unrelenting. Interest. Now they're interested. After everything. You're going to take their word over the life we've built together. The older child services worker, Lisa, stepped in, her tone firm but not unkind. "This isn't about taking sides. It's about following procedure. If they're her biological parents, they have certain rights. Rights they gave up when they left her." The social worker countered sharply, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Let's not pretend they've acted in her best interest up to this point." Lisa's expression softened, but her professionalism remained intact. "I understand your frustration, but we have to do this by the book. The system may not be perfect, but it's what we have to work with." The man looked down at the little girl, who was now trembling in his arms, her fear palpable. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "She's not just some case file. She's my family." The room went quiet again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. But before anyone could respond, the door burst open, and the second officer stepped in, holding a tablet. "Sir," he said, addressing his partner, "we just received footage from earlier tonight. You need to see this." The lead officer frowned but took the tablet, his eyes scanning the screen. As he watched, his expression darkened, his jaw tightening. He turned the tablet toward his partner, who leaned in to see. Whatever they were watching, it wasn't good. "What is it?" the man demanded, his voice edged with panic. "What's on that video?" The officers exchanged a look, clearly debating how much to reveal. Finally, the lead officer turned to him, his voice measured. "It's footage from a nearby gas station where the girl's parents were spotted earlier tonight. They weren't alone." "What does that mean?" The social worker pressed, her tone sharp with concern. "It means," the officer continued grimly, "they were with individuals known to law enforcement. People tied to less than reputable activities." The implications were clear, and the room seemed to shrink under the weight of this new information. The man's mind raced, piecing together what this could mean for the little girl's safety. If her parents were involved with dangerous people, how could anyone justify giving them a say in her future? The social worker seized the moment, her voice fierce. "This changes everything. You can't seriously consider letting them near her, not when there's evidence of criminal activity." Lisa's expression faltered, and even the younger worker with the clipboard seemed uneasy. The officers exchanged another glance, their earlier confidence now replaced with uncertainty. "We need to verify everything," the lead officer said, though his tone lacked its earlier conviction. "This is all happening quickly, and we need to ensure we're not jumping to conclusions." "You don't have time to wait," the social worker shot back. "Every second you delay puts her at risk." The man felt his hands trembling, not with fear, but with anger and desperation. He looked at the little girl, her innocent face a stark reminder of what was truly at stake. "Please," he said, his voice raw, "don't let them take her. She's safe with me. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that." The tension in the room was electric, each person grappling with the gravity of the situation. The officers stepped aside to confer quietly, their hushed voices blending into the background hum. The man could feel the walls closing in, his options dwindling with every passing second. But just as the despair began to settle in, the younger child services worker spoke up, his voice hesitant but clear. "What if we issue an emergency protective order? It would give us more time to investigate without disrupting her current placement." The room stilled as everyone processed the suggestion. Lisa looked at him, surprised but thoughtful. "That's not a bad idea," she admitted, though her tone was cautious. "It's unconventional, but given the circumstances." The lead officer frowned, clearly weighing the risks. Finally, he nodded. "We'll need approval from the supervisor, but it's worth exploring." The man felt a glimmer of hope, fragile but real. He held the little girl close, whispering softly to her, "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. I promise." But even as the possibility of a reprieve hung in the air, the uncertainty remained. The girl's parents were out there, their intentions unclear, their actions raising more questions than answers. And with every twist and turn, the stakes grew higher, the path forward more perilous. The officers stepped out to make the call, leaving the man, the social worker, and the child services workers in tense silence. The man's mind raced, grappling with the sheer unpredictability of the night. He didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was certain. He wasn't giving up without a fight. The air felt heavy with anticipation as everyone waited for the officers to return. The man sat with the little girl in his arms, her small fingers clutching his shirt, as though letting go might make everything fall apart. The social worker stood nearby, her arms crossed and her gaze sharp, while the child services workers exchanged murmured words that couldn't quite mask their own unease. When the officers finally stepped back into the room, their expressions revealed little, but the gravity of their presence was impossible to ignore. The lead officer carried a stack of papers in one hand and a determined look in his eyes. He nodded toward the man and spoke directly to him. "We've made a decision," he said, his tone measured but firm. "Based on the evidence and the urgency of the situation, an emergency protective order has been approved. The girl will remain in your custody for now, while we conduct a thorough investigation into her biological parents." Relief washed over the man like a wave, his grip on the little girl tightening as though to shield her from anything that might come next. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the tension in his chest loosen just enough to breathe. "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely audible but filled with gratitude. But the officer wasn't finished. He set the papers on the table and folded his arms. "There's more," he said, his tone shifting to something heavier. "We've been able to gather more information about the parents. It turns out the people they were with earlier tonight weren't just random acquaintances. They were involved in a trafficking operation." The room fell silent. The weight of the revelation was like a punch to the gut, leaving everyone stunned. The man felt his stomach churn as the implications sank in. "Trafficking," he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You mean they were trying to?" The officer nodded grimly. "We believe their intent was to exploit her. The girl's parents may not have acted out of love or concern for her well-being. They may have been trying to reclaim her for far darker reasons." The man's heart broke at the thought, his anger rising like a storm. He looked at the little girl, who seemed blissfully unaware of the horrors she had narrowly escaped. He couldn't fathom how anyone could think of using her as a pawn, let alone her own parents. The social worker stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "This is why we fight so hard for kids like her. It's not just about paperwork or procedures. It's about protecting them from things like this." Lisa, the older child services worker, looked visibly shaken. "I'll admit, I was skeptical at first," she said, her voice softer now. "But it's clear you're the only one who has her best interests at heart. I'm sorry for doubting you." The man didn't respond, his focus entirely on the little girl. He stroked her hair gently, whispering reassurances even as his mind raced with a mix of relief and rage. The officers began discussing the next steps, more interviews, additional security measures, but the man barely heard them. His priority was keeping her safe, no matter what it took. Just when it seemed like the worst was over, the younger officer's radio crackled again. He frowned as he listened, his expression growing more concerned with each passing second. He exchanged a glance with his partner, who gave a curt nod. "What now?" the social worker asked, her tone wary. The younger officer hesitated before speaking. "The parents. They're claiming they were coerced into the trafficking operation. They're saying they were under duress, threatened by the people they were with. They're asking for leniency and a chance to explain. The room erupted into a flurry of voices, everyone reacting to the unexpected twist. The man felt a fresh wave of frustration rise within him. "They're lying," he said firmly. "They abandoned her without a second thought. Now they're trying to play the victim." The lead officer raised a hand to calm the room. "We're not taking their claims at face value," he said, "but we have to follow up. If there's even a shred of truth to what they're saying, it could complicate things." The man shook his head, his disbelief palpable. "How can you even entertain the idea? They put her in danger. They don't deserve a second chance." The social worker stepped in, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This isn't about what they deserve. It's about what's best for her. And right now, the best thing we can do is focus on keeping her safe while the truth comes to light." The officers nodded, their expressions serious but determined. "We'll keep you updated," the lead officer said. "For now, the protective order stands. She stays with you." As the officers prepared to leave, the man felt a mix of exhaustion and determination settle over him. The fight wasn't over, but for now, she was safe. That was all that mattered. But as the door closed behind them, a nagging thought crept into his mind. If her parents had been coerced, if there was even a chance they weren't entirely to blame, what did that mean for her future? And what other secrets might still be waiting to surface? The little girl stirred in his arms, her voice soft and sleepy. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her eyes searching his for reassurance. He smiled through the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "Yes," he said firmly. "We're going to be okay. I promise." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. Somewhere out there, the people who had threatened her parents were still at large, and their intentions were far from benign. The man knew he couldn't let his guard down, not yet. There was still more to uncover, more battles to fight, and more truths to face. And this time, he wouldn't stop until he knew she was truly safe, no matter what it took. The house had grown quiet again. The officers were gone, the social workers had retreated to plan the next steps, and for the first time in what felt like days, the man found himself alone with the little girl. She was curled up on the couch, holding the stuffed bear he'd given her earlier, her eyelids drooping with exhaustion. Despite everything that had happened, she seemed to find comfort in the small, safe bubble they had created together. He watched her for a moment, his mind racing with everything the officers had said. The revelation about her parents being tied to a trafficking ring had sent his emotions into overdrive. Anger, sadness, and confusion all swirling together. It was hard to reconcile the idea that her biological parents might have been coerced or threatened, even as their actions had put her life in danger. But now, more than ever, he was determined to shield her from whatever shadows lingered in their past. As he sat down next to her, she stirred slightly, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Are the bad people gone?" she asked softly, her voice laced with the innocence of a child who didn't fully understand the gravity of what had happened. "They're gone," he said gently, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "And they're not going to hurt you anymore." She nodded, her eyes closing again, as she clung to the stuffed bear. He stayed there with her, his heart heavy but resolute. He knew that this was just the beginning. There would be court hearings, investigations, and more questions than answers in the days to come. But for now, in this quiet moment, she was safe, and that was enough. The next morning, he was awakened by the sound of his phone buzzing on the table. The social worker had promised to call with updates, and his stomach tightened as he reached for the phone. The name on the screen confirmed his suspicions. It was her. "Good morning," he said, his voice still groggy. "What's the news?" There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a sigh. "It's a mixed bag," she admitted. "We've identified the group the parents were involved with, and law enforcement is making progress on shutting them down. But the parents are sticking to their story about being coerced. It's making things complicated." He pinched the bridge of his nose, frustration bubbling up again. "What does that mean for her?" "For now, nothing changes," she said firmly. "The protective order is still in place, and she stays with you. But we'll need more evidence to figure out the full story. It might take some time." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Okay, thanks for letting me know." After he hung up, he glanced over at the little girl, who was now sitting cross-legged on the couch, drawing with a set of crayons he had found in a drawer. She looked so peaceful, so normal, that it was hard to believe how close she had come to being pulled into something so dark. As the days turned into weeks, life began to settle into a fragile rhythm. The man worked closely with social workers and legal teams to ensure the girl's safety, attending meetings, filing paperwork, and doing everything in his power to prove that she belonged with him. Along the way, he learned more about her likes and dislikes, her favorite foods, and the little quirks that made her who she was. He also began to see glimmers of her resilience. She laughed more often now, her once guarded demeanor softening as she began to trust him. She still had nightmares sometimes, waking up in a panic and calling out for him, but he was always there to comfort her. Slowly but surely, the cracks in her little world were beginning to heal. One evening, as they were eating dinner together, she looked up at him with a curious expression. "Are you my new daddy?" she asked, her voice so matter-of-fact that it caught him off guard. He set down his fork, his throat tightening as he tried to find the right words. "I'm here to take care of you," he said carefully, "to make sure you're safe and happy. That's what matters most." She seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. "Okay," she said simply, as though that answer was good enough for her. But for him, it was a moment of profound clarity. He realized that regardless of what the courts decided or how the investigation unfolded, he had already made his decision. He was all in for her. Months passed, and the case against her biological parents grew more complex. The authorities uncovered evidence that suggested they had indeed been coerced, but their neglect and willingness to put their child at risk could not be ignored. Ultimately, the courts ruled that they were unfit to regain custody, and the man was granted permanent guardianship. When he received the news, he felt an overwhelming mix of relief and responsibility. This was it, the moment he had been fighting for. The little girl was officially his to protect, to nurture, and to love. That night, as he tucked her into bed, she reached up and wrapped her arms around his neck. "I love you," she whispered, her voice sleepy but sincere. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Always." As he sat by her bedside, watching her drift off to sleep, he thought about everything they had been through together. The fear, the uncertainty, the battles they had fought. It had all led to this moment. And while the road ahead would no doubt have its challenges, he felt ready to face it, knowing they had each other. In the end, the story wasn't just about a man fighting for a child or a child finding safety. It was about the power of love, resilience, and the lengths people will go to protect the innocent. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found, and that sometimes the strongest families are the ones we choose for ourselves.